Losing someone is never easy.
It's really not.
And when it's after a long illness, ugh, it hits differently. Your sources really dive into this unique experience, and well, we're here to kind of help make sense of it all.
Yeah.
I mean, we often think of grief as this thing that just happens after a loss. But you've shared some pieces about like mourning that begins even before the person is gone.
Yeah, and that's the thing about illness. It kind of messes with that traditional idea of grieving. You're already processing so much when you're caring for someone who's terminally ill. It's
Yeah.
anticipatory grief, they call it. And it gets all tangled up with caregiving and medical decisions and just the emotional roller coaster of watching someone you love decline.
It's like you're grieving the future you thought you'd have with them.
Uh,
One of the sources I read mentioned that this whole pre-loss grief thing, it can actually make grieving after the death even more complicated.
Absolutely. I mean, you're already carrying the weight of their passing, but then there's like the exhaustion from being their caregiver, the emotional toll of all those difficult medical
Yeah,
decisions,
right.
and this grief that's been building for who knows how long.
So we've got anticipatory grief happening, but then there's also that traditional 5 stages of grief model. I think most people have at least heard of it, but maybe not in this context.
You mean the Kubler-Ross model?
Yeah. Yeah.
It outlines the stages as denial, anger, bargaining, depression, and acceptance.
Right. Denial, anger, bargaining.
But it's not like a checklist.
Yeah.
You don't just check things off in order.
Definitely not. It's way messier than that. You don't just wake up and decide, okay, I'm done with denial. Time for some anger now.
Exactly. It's more like a map of like the emotional landscape.
Okay.
You might experience the stages out of order or go back to one you thought you were done with or even feel a bunch of them all at once. And with grief after an illness, well, those stages can get all mixed up with the pre-loss grief you're already dealing with.
It's interesting you say that. One of the sources mentioned that for people grieving after an illness, that bargaining stage, it tends to stick around a lot longer than the others, which actually makes sense when you think about it, all those what ifs and if only swirling around medical decisions and how the illness progressed.
That's such an important point because with illness, there's often this added layer of what if I had done something differently, pushed for another treatment, maybe caught it sooner. It's so easy to get stuck in that loop of bargaining.
And that's on top of everything else you're feeling. One thing that really struck me was this idea of the relief guilt paradox. Hadn't heard that term before, but man, did it resonate.
It's so common, though. People don't talk about it enough. It's that feeling of relief when your person is finally no longer suffering, but then the guilt of feeling that relief.
Yes, like, shouldn't I just be totally heartbroken? Why do I feel this?
Or it's like your mind's trying to make sense of these completely opposite emotions at the same time.
Oh.
You love this person more than anything. You're devastated they're gone. But there's this part of you that knows their suffering is over. And maybe yours is too, in
Yeah.
a way. And that can feel so messed up.
One of the sources had this quote: "Remind yourself that feeling relief isn't the same as being happy they're gone."
Such an important thing to remember.
It really is.
It's okay to admit you feel relief without judging yourself for it. It doesn't take away from your love or your grief.
So we've got this pre-loss grief, maybe cycling through those stages, and then boom, guilt slams into everything. It's a lot.
It really is.
Where do we even start trying to process all of this?
Well, I think the first step is just acknowledging that everything you're feeling is completely normal. There's no right way or wrong way to grieve, especially after long illness. But there are resources and strategies out there to help you through it.
I remember after my grandma passed, I went to one of those grief support groups.
Yeah.
Just being around other people who got it, who understood what I was going through, it was, I don't know, it was really comforting. You're not alone in all those messy feelings.
Totally. There's something so powerful about connecting with people who've been there. And for people grieving after an illness, support groups can be amazing. It's this safe space to just share your story, without judgment. You can learn coping mechanisms from others who've walked a similar path.
And you were saying earlier that there are even groups for specific illnesses, right? So like if you lost someone to cancer, you could find a group where everyone there understands that unique experience.
Exactly. And within those groups, you might find resources or coping mechanisms you hadn't even thought of. It's like tapping into this collective wisdom.
It's like a shortcut to finding what's helped others instead of having to navigate everything on your own. What about people who aren't ready for a group setting? The sources mentioned journaling as a helpful tool too.
Oh, definitely. Journaling is great because it's private. You process your grief at your own pace, One suggestion I really liked was like writing a letter to the person you lost, expressing everything you're feeling.
I love
It's
that.
like you're still talking to them.
Yeah, like you have the chance to say all those things you didn't get to say or maybe wish you'd said differently. And it doesn't have to be a one-time thing, right? You could keep a journal, like track your emotional journey over time.
Totally. It's about processing your emotions without judging yourself. You're witnessing your own healing process. Sometimes just getting those feelings out of your head and onto paper, it can make them feel less overwhelming.
It's like you're giving those thoughts swirling around in your head somewhere to go.
Exactly. And you can always go back and read those entries later on.
Yeah.
You might even see patterns in your grief or moments where you grew that you wouldn't have noticed otherwise.
Like you've got a physical record of your grief journey. Even if it doesn't feel like you're making progress, you can look back and see how far you've come.
Exactly. Healing isn't a straight line, you know? There are going to be ups and downs, good days and bad days. That's just part of it.
And speaking of which, the sources mention how important self-care is during grief, which honestly can feel impossible when you're in the thick of it.
It's understandable. Self-care might be the last thing on your mind, but it's honestly more important than ever when you're going through intense stress and emotional upheaval, you know?
Because grief takes a toll on you, right? Physically, emotionally, mentally, it's draining.
It really is.
Yeah.
And neglecting your own needs is only going to make things harder.
So what are some things people can actually do for self-care? Especially when it feels like the last thing they want to do.
Well, it doesn't have to be anything complicated.
Mm.
Start small. Focus on the basics. One source really emphasized how crucial sleep is. Grief can mess with your sleep patterns, but if you can aim for 7 to 8 hours a night, it can make a huge difference in your energy levels and just how resilient you are emotionally.
It makes sense, right? When you're sleep deprived, everything just feels harder, like your emotional battery is constantly drained.
Exactly. Along with sleep, you've got to nourish your body with healthy food. I know it's tempting to go for the comfort foods,
Oh, you know what?
but focusing on foods that are actually good for you, meals and snacks that give your body the nutrients it needs, that'll really help you cope.
Like giving yourself the strongest base you can to handle all those intense emotions, right?
Exactly.
I've also heard that even gentle exercise can be good.
Absolutely. When you exercise, your body releases endorphins, and those have mood-boosting effects. And you don't have to go run a marathon or anything. Even a short walk, especially outside, can make a difference.
For me, just getting outside, connecting with nature, that can be really grounding when I'm feeling overwhelmed.
It is grounding, yeah. And speaking of grounding techniques, the sources also talked a lot about the power of mindfulness for navigating grief.
That's something I wanted to ask you about. I've tried some mindfulness stuff before, but I'm curious how it works specifically with grief.
Well, mindfulness is basically about being present in the moment without judging yourself. And when you're grieving, your mind it's usually racing with thoughts about the past or worries about the future or all those what ifs we talked about.
It's like your brain gets stuck in a loop of all the painful thoughts, you know?
Exactly. And mindfulness can help you break free from those thought patterns. It helps you find moments of peace and clarity in the middle of all the chaos.
So it's not about like making those thoughts and emotions go away completely. It's more about learning to just observe them without letting them take over.
Exactly. There are tons of different mindfulness exercises you can try. One source recommended a super simple breathing technique. Find a comfy position, close your eyes if you want, and just focus on your breath. Notice the rise and fall of your chest, how it feels when the air enters and leaves your nose.
What if your mind wanders? Which it totally will, right?
Just gently guide it back to your breath. It's like training a puppy. It takes practice and patience. But you'll find it gets easier to access that mindful state.
Building that mindfulness muscle.
Yes, exactly. The more you use it, the stronger it gets. And even a few minutes of mindful breathing every day can help you manage your grief.
So it sounds like all of these self-care things, sleep, food, exercise, mindfulness, they're all about giving yourself the tools you need to deal with how intense grief can be.
Yeah, it's about giving yourself a fighting chance, you know?
Like they say, you can't pour from an empty cup. You got to take care of yourself to like even begin to deal with grief.
So true. And sometimes that means getting professional help. The sources you shared talked about how valuable therapy and grief counseling can be.
Because sometimes self-care and support systems aren't enough. Grief can just feel too huge to deal with on your own. So when is it? Like, when do you know it's time to call in a professional?
Well, there's no magic answer. But some signs could be if you feel stuck, like you're not moving forward at all, or if your emotions are just too intense to handle, or, if you're dealing with bad anxiety, depression, or even thinking about hurting yourself, it's crucial to reach out, get help.
Grief shows up in different ways for everyone, right?
Yeah.
And it can sometimes lead to other mental health things that need a professional.
Exactly. A therapist can offer a safe space to work through all of that, to challenge those negative thought patterns, and help you find healthier ways to cope.
So it's not just talking about your feelings, it's about getting actual tools to manage them.
Exactly. They can teach you things like cognitive behavioral therapy techniques that can help with those what-if thoughts we were talking about, or mindfulness practices to help you stay grounded.
It seems like the big takeaway here is there's no one right way to heal. You got to find what works for you, whether it's support groups, journaling, therapy, or a mix of everything.
Couldn't agree more. And be patient with yourself. Okay,
Yeah.
grief has no timeline. It comes and goes as it pleases.
There's that saying, healing isn't linear, and man, is it true. Good days and bad days, progress and setbacks, it's all part of it.
Yep. And as you go through it, remember, you're not just grieving a loss, you're also learning to live with it. The sources emphasize finding ways to keep your person's memory alive as you move forward.
That's something I was wondering about. Processing the grief is one thing, but how do you actually start living again and still honor them?
It's a tough balance. Doesn't mean you forget them or move on. It's about finding ways to weave them into your life in a way that feels right.
So it's about keeping their spirit with you.
Yeah, exactly. For some people, that might be setting up a scholarship in their name or maybe volunteering for something they were passionate about. For others, it could be as simple as lighting a candle on their birthday or keeping up a tradition you shared.
Keeping their memory alive in those everyday things.
Exactly. And remember, it's okay to feel joy again, to find things that make you happy, even though you're grieving. They'd want you to keep living.
That's so important to hear. You can have grief and joy at the same time.
You absolutely can. Letting yourself feel joy doesn't mean you love them any less. It means you're honoring them by really living your life.
I love that. It's about weaving their presence into who you are now, even as you move forward.
And as we wrap up, one last thing to think about. What would the person you lost want for you now? What would make them happy to see you doing? Keep that close as you keep healing.
This has been such an insightful deep dive. We could talk about this forever, but I think the biggest thing we've learned is that healing is possible, even after the toughest losses. And while you're going through it, you are not alone, okay? There's support out there, whether it's people you love, support groups, professional help, or just your own inner strength. You've got this.